Memory is the quiet foundation of human life, the invisible thread woven through every moment we call existence, and yet it is more fragile than we often dare to admit. From the instant we wake in the morning to the instant we fall into sleep, we are guided by faint recollections pulled from the past, a name remembered, a street recognized, a promise recalled, a tradition carried forward. We do not often stop to think that none of this is guaranteed. We imagine memory as a record, reliable and constant, but the truth is that every recollection is slippery, incomplete, and susceptible to change. While an individual may forget small pieces of their life in a natural way, there is a far stranger and more disturbing possibility that sometimes emerges from the depths of history and psychology, that entire groups, whole families, even whole towns at once can experience memory not as a personal lapse but as a collective glitch. When these events occur, they leave behind both confusion and awe, reminders that human consciousness may not always be as steady as we pretend, and that society rests on memory as precariously as an island rests upon shifting sands. The opening of such a subject must strike directly at the heart of what makes us human. We pride ourselves on continuity, on the thread of I was, I am, I will be. We extend that pride outward into our culture, into shared holidays, rituals, songs, and histories, all of which depend not on the reality of unchanging events but on people remembering them in the same way. What gives a wedding its meaning is not merely that it took place, but that all who attended recall it. What gives a protest, a funeral, or a celebration its cultural weight is the collective memory that carries it across years. And so when that memory falters for not one or two but for dozens, hundreds, or even thousands, we begin to glimpse a void at the center of our existence, a fragile silence where certainty used to be. Suddenly time itself feels unstable, and the foundation of reality seems uncertain. Imagine waking in the town where you have lived all your life and stepping into the square to find your neighbors milling about in disquiet. They look at a monument that they swear appeared overnight, though you recall it being there for as long as you can remember. They argue that the river at the edge of town has always curved east, though you are certain it once curved west. They insist that yesterday a festival was held, yet when pressed, none can describe the music played, nor the food eaten, nor the words exchanged. Instead, they share a soft impression, as though a great event hovered on the edge of recall, and yet nothing specific comes forth. This is what mass memory glitches reveal, not only the fragility of personal thought, but the shifting ground beneath the collective agreement that defines what truly happened. Throughout history there are scattered whispers of such collective uncertainty. Ancient chronicles sometimes spoke not only of diseases that swept entire villages but also of sudden loss of memory, of nights after which no one could recall the days that came before. Folk traditions from rural Europe tell of villages who believed time itself had folded upon them, leaving them unable to name which season they were in. Stories from Asia describe whole communities who claimed that they remembered rituals no one had ever performed, singing songs of origins that belonged to no record. At first these seem like mere legends, but the disturbing consistency across cultures suggests a deeper phenomenon, a human susceptibility that transcends language and geography, where memory moves not only as a function of one brain but as a field of energy across many, influenced by contagion, by suggestion, by the invisible hand of group psychology. The relevance of such stories is sharpened when we realize how completely we depend on shared memory in modern life. Our economies rely on records, our governments on archives, our schools on curricula, and our laws on testimony. A society without individual memory may limp on, for individual forgetfulness is common. A society without collective memory, however, loses its very foundation. What happens, then, when cracks appear in the Great Wall of shared recollection? What happens when not just one witness to history falters, but a chorus of witnesses stumble together in the same unusual way? The sheer scale of such failure forces us to confront the possibility that memory is never as personal as we think. Perhaps memory itself is contagious, shaped and rewritten as we speak it, as we confirm it together, as we allow dreams, rumors, and pressures to bend it into common form. One well-known expression of this idea in our time is the phenomenon often referred to as the Mandela effect, when vast numbers of people recall an event or detail incorrectly in precisely the same way. A cartoon character's name, a phrase in a novel, the spelling of a brand misremembered across entire populations. Skeptics brush it away as faulty recollection multiplied at scale, but to those who feel the power of collective certainty, it becomes evidence that memory is more porous than expected. Even in this relatively benign form, the idea of collective false memory is unsettling. Yet the deeper accounts, where whole towns forget more than a mere phrase or image, suggest the Mandela effect is a small window into something stranger, the possibility of whole communities waking into states of recall so fractured that reality itself feels bent. It is tempting to offer psychological explanation, to reduce such events to stress, confusion, or cultural suggestion. Psychology has long shown us that memory is plastic, that the brain reframes experiences at every recall. Social psychology demonstrates contagion, the spreading of moods, thoughts, and even false memories from one person to another. Neuroscience suggests that memories are not stored like files in a cabinet but like networks of associations easily disrupted. When many people inhabit similar environments of stress or trauma, their mental reconstructions may align, producing eerily similar distortions. And yet, while these explanations sound sufficient, the lived accounts reveal a far greater strangeness. To those who experience mass forgetting, it feels less like distortion and more like absence. It is not that everyone remembers the wrong thing, it is that everyone remembers nothing, or almost nothing at all, in the same disturbing gap. They stand together facing a silence, aware that they are all missing something vital, unable to name what it is. That shared silence can be more terrifying than a false recollection. Forgetting alone is isolating, but forgetting together collapses the very sense of continuity that binds people to one another. Entire towns have reported waking with little agreement on the preceding day's events, children confused as parents shrug off questions, elders offering no guidance, records contradicting local recollection. Journalists who interview such communities report a disquiet that lingers, as though the people themselves are haunted not by ghosts or apparitions but by the simple yet devastating suspicion that time has slipped from their hands. Some describe it as if reality itself stuttered, like a skipping record. Others describe it as a fog in the mind, a heaviness upon the day, where past and present seem unfastened. These reports invite broader questions not only about how memory functions but about what memory truly is. We often assume that memory is nothing more than electrical patterns in the brain, stored and recalled. Yet memory is also deeply social. Each of us constantly reaffirms what we know by speaking it to others, by agreeing on the sequence of events, by codifying it in rituals and artifacts. When such mechanisms break down, the loss is not merely neurological but cultural. It is the loss of the shared story that gives place and people their coherence. And this reveals why mass forgetting is so uncanny. It is not simply an error in individual recall but a temporary collapse of narrative itself, the spilling away of the binding story. From another angle, some traditions step beyond psychological explanations and treat these mass glitches as spiritual or supernatural phenomena. Ancient peoples sometimes described sudden forgetfulness as the work of gods or spirits, punishments delivered upon villages for misdeeds or protections cast over communities to shield them from horrors they were not meant to remember. In myth, forgetting is often a sacred gift, a river to be crossed that erases pain, or a curse that removes identity. To look at mass amnesia through the lens of myth is to see in it a pattern inscribed in the human psyche. We fear memory's absence because memory is what roots the self. We interpret sudden absence as divine intervention, because what else could erase such a fundamental part of life across an entire community without leaving a trace? Of course, to rest in myth is not to solve the problem, and so the modern mind grapples still with the puzzle. We can study collective amnesia as a psychological contagion, as a neurological suppression, or even as a sociological phenomenon whereby communities protect themselves from trauma by forgetting, much as the individual mind dissociates under pain. War zones, disasters, and sudden upheavals sometimes lead towns to glide over the sharpest moments in a haze of forgetfulness. Collective silence replaces collective recollection. And while this offers comfort in some contexts, allowing communities to move forward, it also creates the fertile ground in which mass glitches of memory take root, where whole neighborhoods agree without knowing why that something once known has been lost together. In these ways, both science and myth point to the same central truth: memory is far from secure. To live at all is to participate in a constant reconstruction, to walk across a field where the ground sags and shifts beneath your feet. Collective amnesia is not simply a curiosity for historians and psychiatrists, it is a reminder that reality itself is a fragile consensus, and that beneath our ordinary confidence lies an ocean of uncertainty. This is why the subject grips the imagination when told at night, why it lends itself to quiet listening as one drifts toward rest. Because in the stillness, when the lights are low and the voice in your ear begins to describe whole communities forgetting, the listener perceives that strange tension between comfort and unease. Comfort in the knowledge that forgetting is universal, unease in the possibility that tomorrow the certainty you cling to might vanish in the minds of everyone around you. To settle into this exploration is not to solve a riddle but to rest alongside it, allowing the mystery to reveal its contours. We will move deeper into accounts, wander through landscapes where memory falters, linger on the voices of communities who recall forgetting, and follow the threads of science and speculation alike. At every turn we will meet new possibilities: psychological contagion, neurological pattern, cultural narrative, mythic interpretation. And through all of them will run the central, calming rhythm, that memory is delicate, precious, and endlessly fascinating, that to contemplate its fragility is to discover something true about the human condition. For it is in the very act of recognizing memory's instability that we learn to cherish what we recall, to treat gently the shared stories we tell one another, and to acknowledge that beneath the calm rhythms of life lies an invisible field where even entire towns may, for a time, forget. And so the opening of this story lingers in the twilight between philosophy and narrative, between history and dream. Memory, fragile, communal, and mysterious, stretches like a thin golden thread above the abyss. We will follow that thread into darkness, not in haste, not in fear, but with attentiveness and care. For the more we attend to these mysteries, the more deeply we relax into the knowledge that reality itself is not a fixed stone but a flowing river, and that our role is simply to drift with it, awake to its strangeness, calm in its current, watchful of its silences. To listen to such tales is to yield to the rhythm of time, the tick of memory, the hush of forgetting, and to let the mystery of mass memory glitches carry you softly, gently, into a space where questions float like clouds and the still night air invites sleep. Across the centuries, human beings have often recorded not only the great wars, the fires, the famines, and the discoveries, but also the subtler mysteries that disturbed their sense of order. One of the most unsettling threads in these scattered chronicles is not the tale of what people remembered but the accounts of what they failed to remember together. When reading through the records of villages long gone, preserved in monastic annals or local archives, one finds curious notes about days or nights when stories no longer aligned, when whole communities awakened with no certainty of what had preceded them. These reports do not carry the spectacular violence of cataclysm. Instead, they possess a quiet eeriness, a hushed sense of people realizing that what they took as self-evident had slipped through their collective grasp. It is precisely this subtlety that makes them linger, not in the realm of fantasy, but as difficult memories in their own right, memories of forgetting, held by generations that followed. One of the oldest patterns comes from medieval Europe, where small towns in valleys and mountain regions sometimes documented inexplicable lapses in local festivals. Monks noted how entire villages failed to recall the year of planting or the specific ritual performed the season before. These were not the routine errors of scribes or the neglect of individuals. Rather, such notes were accompanied by repeated testimony across many voices that something had been erased from communal life. Farmers insisted that fields had been tilled, yet neighbors gave conflicting details about when and by whom. Elders seemed unable to remember the songs they were meant to teach their children, songs embedded so securely in tradition that forgetting them seemed impossible. Historians now might attribute such disruptions to famine, illness, or stress, yet the way these episodes were written down suggests that the people involved felt more than mere distraction. They felt as though a curtain had descended between them and the day just lived. Further east, tales collected from certain Chinese villages during the late dynastic periods tell of nights after which whole communities woke as blank paper. Accounts describe farmers wandering into their fields unable to recall the stages of crop growth, uncertain if they had watered the soil or left it fallow. It is said that groups of villagers met in prayer halls to ask one another for remembrance, leaning on the hope that someone, perhaps, held a better memory than the rest. Instead, they found themselves aligned in uncertainty, unable to reassemble timelines. These fragmentary stories, passed orally before entering written record, share remarkable similarity with European tales, hinting that collective forgetfulness was not confined to a single culture or belief system, but appeared wherever human beings gathered in close communal life. From the Middle East to South America, scattered evidence persists of similar anomalies. Indigenous groups in the Amazon basin describe silent seasons, times when entire clusters of families awoke unable to recall the sequence of days leading into harvest. Instead of passing stories from one generation to another about abundance, they pass stories of confusion, teaching their children that sometimes memory itself could retreat into the forest, leaving a void. In North Africa, colonial-era diaries make occasional note of villages whose inhabitants seem to disagree over the timing of markets or festivals by weeks at a time, unable to settle on the correct date even when evidence of the event lay scattered in the form of goods and decorations. Observers wrote of a disquiet unlike any other, for while hunger and disease could be seen, measured, and explained, this inability to recall seemed to come from nowhere, leaving the witnesses unsettled long after the people themselves moved forward. The persistence of such accounts across geography and era raises a profound question: were these cases exaggerated folklore growing in the telling, or are we dealing with a universal phenomenon of the human mind, one that emerges under particular conditions? Modern psychology has offered concepts like mass psychogenic illness, contagion of hysteria, and shared false memories to explain away collective phenomena, yet these explanations remain thin when confronted with evidence that points not to outbursts of excitement or frenzy but to collective absence, a void in the mental life of hundreds at once. The mysterious endurance of these narratives suggests that forgetting together is a real experience, and one capable of reshaping entire communities. Consider for a moment how societies function without precise written archives. For many communities across history, memory itself was the archive, rituals repeated at the right time, stories retold in the right order, songs sung with faithful rhythm. The accuracy of these performances ensured the continuity of cultural life. If suddenly a fraction of that memory is suspended, the consequences can ripple outward for decades. A generation may grow up lacking part of its narrative inheritance. The survival of oral tradition depends precisely on its uninterrupted passage from memory to speech, and collective amnesia cuts the cord abruptly, producing what looks like a blank chapter in the collective diary of a people. These blank spaces become haunted by speculation, filled in after the fact with imagination both comforting and terrifying. The 20th century, with its expansion of journalism and record-keeping, offers us glimpses of more recent cases that are even harder to dismiss. Reports occasionally surfaced in local newspapers describing towns or gatherings where shared memory faltered. A frequently cited story tells of a European village in the 1920s where an entire population later denied the occurrence of a public parade, despite photographic evidence of the celebration. Interviews from the time reflect a peculiar dissonance. While the photographs were real and some physical remnants of the event such as banners and costumes still existed, the recollection of ordinary citizens had dissolved. Many insisted the event simply had not taken place, even while staring at proof. The result was an unresolvable tension between material evidence and living testimony. Other accounts arrive from wartime, where soldiers and townspeople alike described stretches of time disappearing. After intense bombings or brutal battles, groups of survivors sometimes behaved as though a day had vanished, with inconsistent testimony about how they had reached the present hour. Trauma surely played a role, suppressing unbearable recollections. Yet again, the striking feature is uniformity, not just one or two recounting gaps, but large groups whose absence aligned, as though darkness had swept across a field of minds at once. Such uniform gaps lend weight to the possibility that collective forgetting can reach beyond individual psychology and tap into broader social dynamics, linked perhaps to survival mechanisms embedded deep in the brain. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, with communication and technology tying communities more intricately together, another layer appears. The phenomenon of large numbers of people recalling events differently than official records describe began to circulate widely, now famous under the phrase commonly called the Mandela effect. Whether it was the spelling of a brand, the dialogue in a film, or the details of an assassination, millions reported being utterly certain of memory that contradicted evidence. This effect exposes the same fragile truth: memory is not simply personal but is profoundly collective, and when a group forgets or misremembers together, the result is a clash between lived experience and documentation. While skeptics reduce it to cognitive bias, those who feel the certainty of the error argue it suggests deeper mysteries. Perhaps memory slips reveal alternate strands of reality or fractures in the way consciousness interacts with time. The cumulative impression from all these cases, folk tales, early modern chronicles, wartime reports, media phenomena, is that mass memory glitches cannot be neatly confined to superstition. they appear to follow humanity wherever it goes, surfacing under specific pressures. And what unites them is not loud spectacle but subtle disorientation, the chilling experience of shared silence. People gather to ask what happened, and none can answer with confidence. This silence hollows out communal identity. Families look at one another uncertain whether yesterday existed as they thought. Neighbors doubt neighbors. Communities fracture over what was real. And in the fracture comes fear, because if remembering is unstable at the collective level, then even reality itself begins to feel unstable. Within the framework of modern science, one might seek clearer explanations. Collective stress, whether caused by famine, war, or disease, can suppress memory formation, leaving communities with fragmented recall. Toxic exposure, hallucinogenic substances, or environmental influences might align lapses across groups. Sociologists point to mechanisms of rumor and conformity, where once a few authoritative voices express uncertainty, others follow to maintain social cohesion, leading to a cascade of shared forgetting. Psychiatrists trace parallels in dissociative amnesia, in which individuals erase disturbing memories, and speculate on how this response might magnify in entire populations during extreme events. These perspectives provide partial clarity, but none can fully account for the sheer scale and uniformity observed in historical accounts. They explain pieces, but leave intact the possibility of unexplained dimensions. Outside the domain of explanation lies interpretation, and here cultures have woven myths and symbols around the phenomenon. Forgetting at scale, rather than being seen as error, has often been understood as divine intervention. A God who wishes to protect people from unbearable truth may wipe it from their minds as a gift of mercy. A spirit punishing arrogance may erase precious memories to humble a whole town. Ancient rivers of oblivion flow through mythologies precisely because forgetting was experienced not as small accident but as an overwhelming force. In these mystical views, memory lapses bind humans to the greater cosmos, reminding them that consciousness is not entirely their own possession but something lent, subject to being withdrawn. The implications for societies that rely on memory to preserve justice and history are immense. If entire populations can truly lapse, if courts, schools, and neighborhoods can forget even while proofs still stand, then trust in social reality itself is threatened. The unsettling aspect of reading these accounts, and even more so of hearing them aloud in the hushed hours of night, is the realization that you, too, rely fully upon the memory of those around you. Were they all to forget, your certainty would dissolve at once. There is a vulnerability here that is both frightening and strangely unifying. Because we depend on each other to hold the past, we become aware of the collective nature of existence. We live not just in our own heads but in the web of memories exchanged, corrected, strengthened, and occasionally lost together. As this river of history flows into the present, the line between ordinary misremembering and extraordinary glitches grows thin. Every missed appointment, every misplaced name is innocent in itself. But across entire groups errors can synchronize, leaving historians centuries later wondering why records conflict. Modern skeptics say these are exaggerations. Yet the haunting consistency of testimonies in regions that never spoke to each other, cultures divided by ocean and era but united in describing communities forgetting, presses us to take the matter seriously. There may be dimensions of human consciousness that science has only begun to map, fields of influence where minds subtly link to one another, leading not only to shared joy or sorrow but to shared lapses. The mystery of mass memory glitches therefore sits at the junction of many disciplines: history, psychology, anthropology, spirituality. To listen to their tales is to lean into uncertainty, but also to rest within it. The purpose of returning to these stories is not to leave us anxious but to cultivate awareness of the delicate fabric beneath everyday life. If memory is as unstable as these episodes suggest, then reality itself becomes softer, calmer, like fabric folding and unfolding rather than stone rigid beneath our feet. This in turn creates an atmosphere suited to reflection, to stillness, to the calming realization that most of what we hold is temporary, and that perhaps it is this very impermanence that makes it precious. Thus flows the narrative of towns forgetting, of communities standing bewildered in the absence of recollection, of the human being not as solitary recorder of facts but as member of a field where memory can suddenly vanish in unison. The evidence of this spans centuries, cultures, and conditions, from harvest field to battlefield, from ritual hall to market square. And through all of it lingers the quiet recognition that we are creatures not simply of logic and archive, but of consciousness that drifts together like wind across grass. In tuning to the subtle patterns of this drifting, we open ourselves not only to mystery but to calm, recognizing memory for what it is, a fragile bridge stretched across the unknown, a bridge we walk together, sometimes steady, sometimes trembling, and sometimes mysteriously fading from under our very feet. In the centuries leading into our modern age, whispers of entire towns forgetting grew into more concrete reports, cases recorded not in myth or in passing folklore but in the language of journalism, medical observation, and official inquiry. What makes these modern anomalies particularly gripping is their tangibility. We are no longer dealing with sagas traveled across generations, fragile with the distortions of oral tradition, but with stories backed by newspapers, by documents, by photographs, by the testimonies of people who lived only decades ago. These accounts, still debated today, push the phenomenon of mass memory glitches out of the realm of fable and into the uneasy light of possibility. They sit at the intersection of fact and mystery, challenging us to reconcile what was written, what was witnessed, and what was somehow lost. One of the more striking examples comes from the early 20th century, when a small European town emerged in headlines for denying the occurrence of an event that was plainly visible in evidence. The story tells that in the summer months a festival was held, a gathering with music, colorful banners, costumed dancers, and celebratory processions. Photographs from the day exist, showing dozens of smiling faces, children waving flags, elders shaking hands, musicians caught in mid-performance. And yet, months later, when journalists returned to ask the community about this festival, they were met with blank expressions. Some denied outright that the festival had occurred at all, insisting they would surely remember something so grand. Others stated vaguely that perhaps an event had been held, but they had no memory of participating. Entire families who appeared in photographs posed together could not recall ever having worn the costumes or marched in the square. The eeriness of the dissonance spread quickly in nearby towns, and reporters documented the chill of interviewing people who stared at images of themselves celebrating yet felt no personal tie to the joy pictured. The case remains unexplained, sitting stubbornly in archives as though daring future generations to unlock its riddle. Another class of reports comes not from festivals or ceremonies but from darker times, eras of conflict when the mechanism of remembering should have mattered most. Soldiers in the trenches of the First World War occasionally wrote of lost days, stretches of time that whole companies could not recall. After bombardments, units emerged unable to narrate precisely what sequence of events had transpired. They agreed in their silence. Later, attempts to reconstruct the timeline from diaries and military logs revealed gaps that were never convincingly explained. Some suggested shell shock, trauma, or neurological impact from proximity to explosions. Yet testimony continues to note not only individual lapses but entire groups unable to anchor themselves to a past they should have shared. In one case, surviving villagers recalled with certainty that their town had not been struck, while photographs from reconnaissance flights revealed destroyed buildings. The survivors, however, walked the ruins as though they had always been debris, denying in unison the violence that had reduced their neighbors' homes to piles of stone. Decades later, in the aftermath of the Second World War, similar stories emerged. Communities who experienced sudden occupation or rapid liberation sometimes told interviews they could not recall key days, even weeks, of events. Journalists recorded peculiar uniformity in these lapses. It was as though entire tapestries of collective experience had been sheared away, leaving only scattered threads. When pressed, survivors sometimes grew agitated, as though the probing itself threatened to undo whatever mental balance maintained their present composure. Psychologists analyzing these testimonies proposed theories of protective suppression, suggesting that when trauma was too heavy to endure, the human mind not only as individual defense but as group instinct concealed it. But the shared nature of the erasure remained peculiar. How could dozens of brains suppress in precisely the same manner, aligning their amnesia with uncanny precision? The pattern unsettled doctors and left unanswered questions that echo still. Not all examples are bound to war or to grand celebrations. Sometimes collective forgetting has appeared in the fabric of ordinary civic life. In the 1960s, a small American town gained attention when reporters discovered an entire community insisted that a municipal building under construction had only recently begun, despite documentation showing it had been standing for nearly a year. The interviews revealed an unnerving split. Officials maintained their records were accurate, photographs of ribbon cutting circulated in local papers, yet hundreds of citizens spoke with conviction that the building had appeared suddenly, fully formed without the months of construction noise they should have remembered. Parents told how their children walked past the lot daily on their way to school without ever mentioning scaffolding or workers, and yet the building now stood unchallenged, accepted, though detached from the memory of its rise. Residents struggled in their own words, torn between evidence and perception, their voices carrying both embarrassment and quiet despair. Even now, decades later, scattered letters and memoirs demonstrate that people from that region held deeply to the conviction that something had gone strangely wrong with time itself. In the last decades of the 20th century, new technologies added another dimension. With television, radio, and eventually video recording widely available, communities could confront mismatches between memory and record more directly than before. Reports circulated of entire groups recalling broadcasts that seemed never to have aired or missing out on events that appeared on tape. One case tells of a sporting event celebrated in what should have been unforgettable local triumph, yet years afterward many residents disclaimed memory of attending, cheering, or celebrating. Stadium footage showed packed bleachers filled with the very faces who later denied their presence. Explanations tend toward the ordinary. Perhaps people forgot because countless other games occurred. Perhaps the once joyous event was suppressed under new stresses, but the cumulative effect, the sheer number who disclaimed, begins to resemble the older legends of towns who forgot entire festivals. Modernity's cameras did not resolve the mystery, they simply exposed the dissonance more sharply. The arrival of digital communication, social media, and online archives has perhaps heightened awareness of these glitches rather than diminished them. Where once forgetting was localized, confined to villages and valleys, now entire nations can participate in the strange disorientation of contradictory memory. Millions attest to remembering different spellings, different phrases, different outcomes. While these may not rise to the extreme of entire towns waking blank, they reveal the scale at which human societies can align in false certainty. The Internet has given visibility to what might once have remained isolated confusion. Ordinary people can discover thousands sharing the same flawed recollection, producing a sense not of individual error but of mass dislocated truth. Analysts categorize this under the Mandela effect or collective false memory, yet to many who feel the weight of conviction the phenomenon cuts deeper, exposing the fragility of consensus even in the age of cameras and recordings. When surveying all these modern anomalies, a theme emerges that mirrors the older legends. The essence of the disturbance is not spectacle or chaos but the simple, quiet misalignment between what evidence says and what large groups of people recall. Sometimes whole weeks vanish under the pressure of war. Sometimes a building seems to rise from nothing. Sometimes photographs contradict blank faces. Each occurrence stirs the same unease, compelling us to recognize that memory is not solely internal but woven between us like fabric that can tear across its whole breadth. And when it tears, the wound is shared. Attempts to explain these modern cases rarely satisfy everyone. Neurological theories suggest collective environmental effects, chemical exposure, stress hormones, perhaps shared trauma. Sociological theories propose conformity, where once enough people express forgetting, others bend their memory to match, resulting in a cascade toward consensus. Anthropological accounts point to ritual amnesia, practices whereby societies deliberately forget as a form of coping, and suggest that some of these glitches may simply be unconscious cultural continuations. Yet the endurance of reports that contradict physical evidence leaves an unease that none of these explanations resolve. To say people forgot is ordinary. To say people forgot in perfect synchrony, and forgot despite photographs and archives, presses against the boundaries of what we expect from human cognition. For those who lived through them, collective lapses often carry a dreamlike quality. Interview transcripts preserve testimony of individuals describing fog, silence, disorientation. "It feels like trying to grip water with my hands," said one villager when asked about missing days during conflict. Another citizen, confronted with photographs of a festival, said flatly, "That looks like me, but it's not my life." Such responses resist the simple boxes of explanation. Trauma, suggestion, bias all play roles. Yet those who felt the absence describe something deeper, the sense of reality moving just beyond their fingertips. And even decades later, they recall not the lost event itself but the sensation of loss, the uncanny recognition that memory had betrayed them and had done so not in solitude but in company with all their neighbors. The lived feeling of these mass glitches, relayed softly in journals and interviews, contains an atmosphere well suited to quiet reflection. There is a rhythm to the accounts that echoes twilight itself, slow voices describing fog, minds straining against absence, people drifting on the edge of forgetting. Even the attempts of scientists and philosophers to explain them bring no harsh conclusion but instead more layers of uncertainty. And perhaps it is this lingering uncertainty that extends the fascination. For when confronted with the possibility of whole communities forgetting, the listener is invited into the tender mystery of consciousness itself, where memory is no sturdy stone but mist moving across fields, where even in the age of evidence our minds remain fallible and our societies vulnerable to silence. As one looks across the record, ancient and modern alike, the impression builds that memory glitches may not be rare anomalies but recurring features of human life, surfacing again and again under pressure, under joy, under suffering, under peace. They haunt archives because they reveal something we strain to deny, that our continuity as persons and as peoples depends entirely on memory's fragile dance, and that dance may falter at times in unison, leaving us uncertain whether the past has slipped from being or whether it never was at all. To meditate upon this is to rest in awareness of fragility, to see ourselves less as masters of recall and more as travelers through shifting shadows, dependent on one another to hold the past, and sometimes watching together as that past drifts quietly into silence. And so the modern anomalies, far from resolving the mystery, amplify it. Ancient legends might be doubted for lack of evidence, but photography, journalism, and digital archives show us that dissonance survives into our own age as vividly as ever. The mystery is alive, not in distant folklore but in recent memory, not only in forgotten villages but in cities brimming with cameras and witnesses. If such dissonance can exist here, now, then perhaps it is not anomaly but essence, a reminder that to be human is to construct reality on the shifting sands of memory, to live always vulnerable to its sudden collapse, to walk always aware that even entire towns may forget together in the same unsettling silence. The puzzle becomes even more intriguing when we consider not only the silences of whole towns forgetting but the distortions of large populations remembering incorrectly in perfect synchrony. If in the past communities stood bewildered by absence, in our modern moment entire generations sometimes stand equally bewildered by certainty in details that, upon investigation, turn out not to exist. This peculiar inversion shifts the mystery from what slips away into void to what appears within memory yet never truly was. It forces us to concede that forgetfulness is not the only danger. Just as striking, just as unsettling, is the capacity of hundreds, thousands, even millions to carry together a fabricated recollection with uncanny conviction. In this dissonance where memory mistakes multiply in the same pattern, we glimpse the fragility of remembering in a different form, one not of erasure but of invention. The examples now are well known and widely circulated. Generations remember with conviction a certain line spoken in a famous film, words quoted, shared, turned iconic in cultural memory. Yet when the film is replayed unedited, that line is simply not there. Millions describe the spelling of a brand a certain way across decades of browsing through shops, yet every archive insists the spelling was different, and all known packaging shows another version. People point to the death of a political figure they were certain had occurred years earlier, recalling discussions in homes, in classrooms, even in news coverage, only to discover that the person lived on for decades more before passing away at a later date. These are not trivial accidents, for the quantity of people invested in their recollection transforms each case into a quiet puzzle, a chorus of voices aligning in an error as though rehearsed. This phenomenon forces us once again to reflect on what memory truly is. If our recollections were fixed like photographs, stored securely in an inner archive, such alignments of error would be improbable. But neuroscience reminds us that every memory is reconstructed at the moment of recall, rebuilt like a fragile sandcastle from means and fragments. In this rebuilding lies the chance for distortion. If one brain can distort in small recognizable ways, entire populations can distort in symmetry when exposed to the same influences: media, conversation, cultural repetition. Yet for those who live with profound certainty of error, this mechanical explanation offers little comfort. Their conviction feels immovable. To be told one's memory is mistaken is disorienting. To be told millions of others are mistaken in the same way becomes uncanny. Some lean into the impossible explanation that reality itself has shifted, that memories align from another world, a parallel history where details truly were as remembered. Others remain resolutely skeptical, trusting neuroscience to unravel it eventually, and yet the debate itself reveals how shaky the ground can be beneath our common experience. The popular phrase used in the modern age for this experience captures precisely that peculiarity, a phenomenon of collective false memory so widespread that it has taken cultural root. And while the examples may at first appear light-hearted, curious details about stories, spellings, or logos, the phenomenon grows unnerving when one applies the same mechanics to deeper matters. If millions can misremember trivial cultural references, can entire populations misremember history? Have there been moments already where a fact accepted in consensus rests on misaligned recollection rather than on enduring record? The suspicion flickers quietly at the edges of our minds, never fully answered, never entirely dismissed. For psychologists, this alignment of mistaken memories can be traced to the very structure of human cognition. First impressions are not stable, and false details can slip into the memory stream with little resistance if repeated often enough. Each time memory is recalled, the story travels not in pristine state but subject to further editing. Over years the false element cements itself, and if people around us confirm it, our conviction deepens. The mechanisms of conformity, of suggestion, and of social reinforcement do the rest, producing communities utterly convinced of what never occurred. And yet the explanation does not resolve the haunting sensation of standing with thousands of others in certainty, only to be confronted with proof that the certainty rests on smoke. For we wish to trust not only our own minds but the presence of others. If everyone around us insists on what we also feel inside, how can we not believe together? To discover a united mistake is therefore not only puzzling but destabilizing. This aspect of collective distortion has increasingly drawn attention in our era precisely because mass communication allows such comparisons instantly. In prior centuries, perhaps thousands did forget details together, or distorted them, but without connectivity, their errors remained invisible as shared phenomena. Now, when a single question arises, millions can reveal alignment within hours, voicing the same misremembered detail from continents apart. The shock lies exactly in discovering oneself not alone but accompanied by thousands. In discovering this shared maze of false recall, people experience both comfort and unease: comfort in company, unease in the realization that the human mind may not serve as dependable witness after all. One should observe the texture of such experiences when described. Those who live with these false recollections do not report them as vague impressions. They describe vivid certainty, memory marked with detail, emotion, and context. A person recalls where they sat when hearing the news of a figure's passing, whom they were with, what meal they were eating, even the way the air sounded. They recall seeing the headline, feeling the shock, discussing it with friends. Later, upon discovering the event never occurred, they bear not only confusion but a sense of betrayal. What happens to the trust inside us when a memory stitched with so much felt texture collapses under proof? What happens when thousands share the same collapse together? It is both tragic and strangely fascinating, a reminder that memory need not require truth to grow vibrant. Underlying this is a deeper recognition of how susceptible humans are to external cues. One word misspoken, one rumor repeated, one joke carried forward, and an image circles the world to settle in minds as fact. Over time, memory folds that image inward until the reconstruction of the past appears seamless. The human brain does not mark inside itself a note saying this detail uncertain. Instead, the detail lives there with the same boldness of accuracy as all others, disguising its origin, disguising its shakiness. That is why whole populations can swear to its correctness despite evidence. The mind is built not to record but to narrate, and narration naturally lends itself to cohesion over accuracy. In this way, collective illusions teach us the truth of memory more broadly. We do not possess a library but a living storybook, one another's voices constantly editing its pages. The style of these false memories, however, adds to the sensation of mystery. Certain themes repeat themselves, alternate spellings, altered logos, phrases from literature or film. These are not random. They sit exactly at the intersection of cultural repetition, where mass populations are exposed together across years. They are small details overlooked when they occurred but magnified by the shared environment in which they were absorbed. When one detail shifts subtly, millions hold on to the earlier impression, and when challenged, they recall with conviction. Yet although science aligns with this explanation, the eerie possibility lingers that something deeper stirs. Why, out of all possible details, do these same few anomalies capture thousands simultaneously? Why not endless variety? Why this disturbing convergence again and again? The pattern itself unsettles in its consistency. Some interpreters step beyond psychology and into speculative territory, proposing that these anomalies represent disturbances in reality. The image invoked is one of parallel worlds brushing against our own, slight shifts that leave memory as evidence of another path. In this view, the presence of millions sharing the alternate detail becomes proof of its once true existence. These ideas may never find proof in science, yet they reveal the yearning in human imagination to account for deeply felt conviction. Even when we accept scientific explanations, we cannot resist the strangeness of standing with vast company in wrongness, the uncanny sense that the fabric of time has briefly faltered. It is worth noting how such collective misremembrance shapes society itself. The trivial matters amuse, sometimes creating shared jokes. But the potential extends further, for memory is the ground on which culture grows. If culture can misremember a phrase, it can misremember an event. Wars, policies, conflicts. If errors aligned at such scale, history itself would be susceptible. Thus each small case whispers a larger warning, that the accuracy of our shared past depends not on the permanence of human recall but on fragile external records, and even those can be doubted when thousands testify otherwise. Social trust hinges on the presumption that memories match, and when they do not, the argument stretches indefinitely. The psychological experiments that probe these matters reinforce the difficulty. Participants easily incorporate false suggestions into memory, later swearing to details planted casually by researchers. Families sometimes record disagreements over the presence or absence of events from decades before, each side absolutely certain in their recollection. The dividing line between true and false becomes blurred, as the conviction of memory bears no necessary link to its reality. Extend such blurring across whole populations, magnify it in the arena of culture, and one arrives at the eerie experience of millions aligning in error. In a quiet way, thinking about these phenomena becomes soothing rather than alarming. For in accepting the instability of memory we loosen our grip upon certainty and learn to inhabit the present with gentleness. The mystery itself induces calm. As we drift through stories of whole nations misremembering, whole towns sinking in error, we begin to recognize ourselves in miniature. Each of us forgets. Each of us invents. Together we bind those forgettings and inventions into patterns. To reflect on this is not to fear the fragility of consciousness but to acknowledge its fluid beauty. Memory is not stone but river, bending, splitting, rejoining, carrying new reflections each season. That sometimes entire populations drift together into the same bend is part of the wonder of the current. So we arrive at a curious balance. Science tells us our memories are suggestible constructions, research demonstrates how easily false details settle into groups, and skepticism explains how cultural reinforcement magnifies these errors. And yet the undeniable weight of conviction among millions continues to unsettle. Between proof and conviction lies a gap, and in that gap lingers fascination. To listen to these stories in the quiet of night is to drift into that gap oneself, to rest in the possibility that our certainties conceal hidden frailties, to find calm in the admission that not all mysteries must be solved. We need only acknowledge them, feel their depth, and watch the images of memory, true and false alike, sway gently through the mind like shadows through a twilight field. If one listens carefully to the rhythm of these mysteries, a clear pattern begins to emerge. Behind the strange silences of entire towns, behind the uncanny certainties of millions who jointly misremember, lies the undeniable influence of one mind upon another. Human beings do not think in isolation. From the moment of birth, every idea, every recollection is shaped in part by the words, faces, and gestures of those around us. To speak of memory without speaking of society is to ignore the most powerful force in cognition. The very nature of remembering is not private but profoundly social, and this sociality means that errors, distortions, and absences need not remain confined to one brain but can spread outward in waves, echoing through communities like ripples through still water. At the heart of collective forgetting is this simple yet haunting reality: minds synchronize more easily than we dare to believe. The mechanics of this synchronization are subtle. At first glance, we imagine autonomy, that each mind holds its own independent record. Yet beneath that surface lies a profound susceptibility. A single confident voice can sway the recollections of a group. A rumor repeated enough times takes on the weight of fact. Even the weakest suggestion, offered with authority, can implant seeds of doubt that germinate quickly in fertile ground. Consider how in ordinary conversation one person may hesitate, wondering if they recall a detail correctly. Another voice, smooth with confidence, provides an answer. The hesitation dissolves, and the provisional thought is replaced by certainty borrowed from outside. Multiply this process across hundreds of interactions, and one sees how easily personal memory can be reshaped by communal influence. Psychologists have long documented this contagious property of human thought. In experiments, when groups are asked to recall simple lists or sequences, individuals often adjust their memory to match the majority, even when the majority is demonstrably incorrect. The fear of standing outside, of appearing mistaken, nudges memory itself toward conformity. When events are vivid and complex, the pattern deepens. Eyewitnesses exposed to others' recollections shift their accounts to align, genuinely believing, with time, that their altered testimony reflects what they saw. This suggests that memory is not a fixed photograph but a dialogue, and that dialogue prioritizes agreement over accuracy. Agreement builds trust, and trust builds cohesion. In the rush to belong, the mind seems willing to trade truth itself for unity. This tendency was no doubt advantageous across evolutionary history. In small, vulnerable groups, cohesion mattered more than precise detail. To survive required trusting one another, seeing the world in synchrony, responding to threats collectively. The mechanics of memory adjusted accordingly. One person wavered, the others pulled them in, the group held fast to a common version. But what kept small communities alive also left them vulnerable in ways neither ancient nor modern people can entirely guard against. That same drive to align produces the eerie phenomena of entire groups lapsing into silence or fabricating alternate truths, for the strength of consensus overpowers the strength of personal conviction. The deep adaptation of the brain to seek belonging can make the individual willing, even eager, to erase and rewrite. Groupthink is one expression of this mechanism, famously studied in the politics of nations and the councils of war, but it pervades far more intimate spaces as well. Families subtly rewrite their pasts to present harmonious stories in gatherings. Communities quietly agree to emphasize certain events while minimizing others. The human need for narrative coherence extends beyond fact into the realm of memory itself. When coherence falters, when contradictions appear, tension arises, and the group subtly negotiates which facts to keep, which to silence. In these negotiations, individuals may forget or remember differently than they once did, yielding their private variation for the sake of shared story. Through such compression, memories that never existed may come to feel real, while memories once vivid may gently vanish unspoken. Add to this the well-known phenomenon of emotional contagion, the way states of feeling spread invisibly among people sharing the same space. When one person laughs with genuine joy, laughter multiplies. When one person trembles, fear can infect a crowd. Memory, being bound to emotion, moves with the same currents. If one person weeps while recounting a version of the past, the emotion lends credibility to the content, and others absorb not only the mood but the memory itself. In gathering after gathering, details shift as voices exchange, until confidence is established where once doubt lingered. To recall together is to reconstruct together. And in reconstruction lies the possibility not only of distortion but of synchrony in distortion. Modern studies of misinformation illustrate this dynamic vividly. Introduce a false detail into a story, repeat it across media, repeat it in ordinary conversations, and soon large populations store it as fact. Audiences are not always passive. They are willing participants in a process their minds are wired to accept. For to doubt constantly would be to isolate oneself, and isolation carries evolutionary threat. The easier path is to adopt the group version, to feel safe in agreement, even if the agreement depends upon an image never truly seen. Thus contagion travels swiftly, and collective amnesia or collective misremembrance becomes the logical result. What is perhaps most unsettling is the realization of how complete such synchronization can be. People do not merely parrot what they hear, with time, they integrate it into their deepest recollections. They dream of it, feel nostalgia for it, live as though it truly happened. The false or the missing detail ceases to be foreign and becomes indistinguishable from their authentic experiences. In such ways, entire populations can walk through streets built upon memories both fragile and invented, convinced of realities that never unfolded. They are not lying, they are not conspiring, they are living truthfully within reconstructions altered by collective flow. The deeper one reflects on this, the more profound the implications. If group influence can reshape the memory of a single anecdote, how much larger is its influence upon whole psyches when trauma strikes? In moments of disaster, when terror seizes the whole body of a community, the drive toward cohesion accelerates. Brains suppress unbearable fragments, silence spreads like a balm, and people wake aligned in forgetting. To step into such a context is to witness the protective synchrony of memory, the flocking behavior of the mind in response to pain. Trauma explains much of collective amnesia not through abnormality but through heightened normality, through the very same impulses that govern daily life magnified to protect the social body. But there are subtler forces at work as well. Suggestibility thrives in liminal states, moments of fatigue, twilight, grief, shock. It is in these contexts that whole groups can be swayed without knowing it. A wandering priest in a medieval village, remarking that perhaps the harvest festival had not occurred, could entice others to agree, particularly if confusion already filled the air. A local leader insisting that no construction had been witnessed could nudge hundreds to doubt their own recollection. The more trusted the voice, the deeper the impression, until silence fills the crowd. The process is not sinister by necessity. It is as natural as breathing, a consequence of human openness to one another in the building of shared world. Drift too far from others and one risks exile, stay with them, and one absorbs their memories as one's own. The spread of memory in this way creates a peculiar architecture, networks of recollection constantly shaped by flow of voices, balanced precariously between truth, belief, and invention. In intimate circles like families or small towns, this architecture is fragile. Remove or reshape a few keystones, and the whole structure bends. In larger populations, influence travels more slowly but still finds momentum, especially when amplified through media or rumor. The digital era has simply made visible a mechanism already present in every street and kitchen throughout history. Minds braid together, their memories entwined, stronger for unity but vulnerable to the distortions unity entails. Examples abound even in everyday life. Consider reunions where friends recall childhood events. Individuals arrive with fragments, with hazy impressions, with half-forgotten narratives. Within hours of conversation, details begin to merge. By the end of the evening, the group shares a reconstructed memory, filled with confidence and laughter, a memory stronger for its cohesion yet perhaps far from historical reality. Such small patterns mirror the grander ones described by historians and anthropologists when whole communities misremember wars, celebrations, or disasters. The scale differs, the mechanism remains the same. Memory is a fluid thing, shaped in company. This fluidity explains why even direct evidence sometimes fails to break collective certainty. Photographs, recordings, inscriptions all can be reinterpreted through the lens of group conviction. A photograph may be dismissed as misdated, a recording as incomplete, an inscription as misunderstood. If entire communities stand in agreement, the weight of consensus may overwhelm even the starkest visual proof. People believe their neighbors before they believe words etched in stone. Trust is the foundation of survival, and the living voices near to us drown out the mute evidence of archives. The more one contemplates this, the more inevitable it seems that mass glitches in memory must occur and recur throughout human history. They are not aberrations but natural consequence of the way cognition intertwines with society. They remind us that memory is not an objective vessel but a bond, one woven between minds, strong in unity but vulnerable in truth. And if minds can align themselves so thoroughly, forgetting together or inventing together, then perhaps what we call reality is not solely external but shaped deeply by the synchrony of our recollections. In other words, the world we know is not only what happens but what we agree has happened, an agreement can shift like a breeze. Far from being cause for despair, this recognition invites calm. To understand that memory is mutable and social makes us gentler with one another. When someone recalls differently than we do, when families dispute dates, when societies argue over the past, we see not malice but the natural divergence of fragile minds. And when we discover ourselves aligned in error, we need not panic. Instead, we can marvel at the power of the collective, the capacity of community to shape perception so completely. For in that power lies both the seed of distortion and the seed of cohesion. To belong is to share memory, and to share memory is always to risk error. This risk is the price of human connection. Lulled by these thoughts, the listener drifts into the deeper realization that memory itself behaves like music. One voice begins a melody, another joins, others harmonize. The tune remembered is not identical to the tune originally played, but it carries the same emotional weight, the same sense of belonging. To forget together is like resting in a note that fades. To misremember together is like improvising upon a theme. The composition is never static, it flows. And perhaps, in the end, accuracy matters less than the bond it creates, the sense of being part of one collective song. As these images unfurl, the mystery of mass memory glitches feels less like a violation of the natural order and more like an amplification of it. Human beings have always been creatures of synchrony. Our hearts entrain to one another in conversation. Our gestures mirror unconsciously. Our laughter multiplies. Our memories, too, entwine. They can glitch not because something alien intrudes but because our very design favors alignment over precision. The true wonder lies not in why these glitches happen, but in how rarely we notice them compared to how constantly such synchronization must permeate our lives. And so we close this meditation resting not in horror but in wonder. The fragility of memory, the readiness of minds to synchronize, the quiet sway of suggestion, all remind us that reality is a dance performed in common. To sleep with this in thought is to accept that the world we recall is fragile, transient, but beautiful in its shared imperfection. For even when accuracy falters, what endures is togetherness, the communion of mind shaping and reshaping the past, telling stories until they sing in harmony, remembering and forgetting as one. It is one thing to acknowledge that minds sync together like instruments in an orchestra, that memory bends beneath the weight of social suggestion and emotional contagion, but it is another to ask why the instrument itself is so fragile. If we wish to understand why entire groups can forget or misremember together, we must peer more closely not only into culture and society, but into the very architecture of the brain, into the fragile networks of neurons and chemicals that hold human experience in place. To do so is to discover that forgetting, whether alone or en masse, is not an accident of imperfection, but an inherent part of what memory is. The brain is built not for eternal accuracy, but for flexibility, for survival, and for adaptation. And in that flexibility lies both our brilliance and our weakness. Every memory you carry rests not in some hidden archive, recorded like a film on a strip of celluloid, but in a labyrinth of activity. When you recall a face, a smell, a word, the brain reconstructs it from fragments stored across many regions: visual cortex, auditory regions, associative networks, emotional centers. Each fragment whispers part of the tale, and neurons fire together in complex choreography to produce the sensation of recollection. This means every act of remembering is in truth an act of creation. It is imperfect, it is flexible, it is alive. But this also means that at every moment there is a chance for distortion, for alteration, for gaps to be filled by invention. And when many people live through the same moment together, exposed to the same cues, the same environment, the same emotional weight, their distortions will often follow the same lines, producing the uncanny synchrony of collective memory errors or collective forgetting. Neuroscience has shown us that the hippocampus, the seahorse-shaped structure deep within the brain, is critical to the encoding of memory. Yet the hippocampus does not work alone. It acts in concert with amygdala, prefrontal cortex, sensory regions, and networks that bind emotion to perception. When the hippocampus fails to encode fully because of stress, fatigue, or trauma, the gaps left behind invite reconstruction later, and in reconstruction lies suggestion's power. Entire communities under high stress, war, or famine may thus underencode their experiences, creating fields of blank space where later false or collective memories can grow, much like moss spreading on unclaimed stone. The very neurobiology of survival undermines the permanence of recollection. Stress, above all, has profound effects on memory. When cortisol floods the bloodstream, as it does during fear or tragedy, the encoding mechanism falters. Short-term memory may wither before it is transferred into long-term storage. Details dissolve before they can root. If this happens across a community in crisis, a bombing, a famine, a storm, then entire groups may awaken with patchy recollections, unsure of the sequence, uncertain of what truly unfolded. Later, in the need to reconstruct, suggestion and rumor help fill the void, creating collective alignment not through accurate encoding but through shared rebuilding. The void is written over with communal ink. Neurological explanation also reminds us of the phenomenon of suppression. The brain, in its brilliance, knows sometimes to protect itself against unbearable pain. Traumatic amnesia is well documented in individuals whose minds wall off unbearable experiences. The suppressed material is not destroyed, but locked away, inaccessible to conscious recall, a closed room inside the neural labyrinth. In groups suffering simultaneous trauma, the prevalence of suppression can align. If entire families experience horror together, entire families may push those memories into shadow together. This coordination is not mystical but biological, each brain following survivorship mechanisms honed across evolution. From the outside, it appears as though the whole community has conspired to forget. From the inside, it is the brain's mercy, spreading across many as if synchronized by invisible hand. Another mechanism is the instability of consolidation. Memories, once formed, require time to solidify, threading themselves through neural networks during sleep. Interference during this window, stress, noise, repeated upheaval can erase recent impressions. If a community experiences chaos night after night, the consolidation process may fail en masse, leaving the sequence of days unanchored. This produces the haunting sense of blankness when asked about yesterday, even when physical evidence suggests something occurred. It is not erasure but failed growth, like seeds scattered on rocky ground. The soil of the mind did not permit rooting. The collective implications of neurological fragility become apparent in phenomena such as mass psychogenic amnesia, in which groups of people simultaneously report memory disruption. These episodes have been described across cultures, sometimes linked to fainting spells, sometimes emerging in clusters of schools or villages. Neural mechanisms combined with emotional contagion create cascades, resulting in dozens of people genuinely unable to recall events, feeling the fog not as pretense but as reality. Such events, recorded medically, show that mass alteration of memory need not be paranormal. The brain is delicate, responsive to chemical imbalances, stress hormones, and suggestion, and when many are exposed to the same environment, their brains respond in similar ways. The fragile instrument plays the same discord across an entire orchestra. But there is also a more ordinary, more constant reason for collective error. The reconstructive nature of memory means that every time we recall, we modify. Each retelling shakes the neural pattern loose, allowing alteration to slip in before it rewires. Think of memory not as ink but as clay. To speak of the past is to take the clay in hand again, press new impressions into it, then return it to storage. Over years and decades, even a detail that began solid may become warped, and when hundreds undergo this process in parallel, their warping leans toward similarity, sculpted by shared language and cues. Collective memory drifts like sculpture under the weather, altered by every season of telling. False memory implantation has been studied in controlled settings, proving how pliant the brain can be. Subjects told repeatedly that they performed an action decades ago begin not only to believe it but to supply sensory detail. They can describe the sights, sounds, even emotions associated with the false event. The hippocampus, primed to weave associations, responds to suggestion as though sculpting reality. When many are exposed to the same implantation, the group becomes aligned in conviction. The parallel to society at large requires little imagination. Whether through rumor, story, or misprint, communities implant shared images into the neural clay of memory. Once seeded, they prosper, growing roots as strong as those of authentic experience. The relationship between memory and sleep adds another dimension. We know that during sleep, the brain simulates, organizes, and integrates the day's events. Dreams weave fragments into narrative, consolidating experiences into long-term learning. But the dreaming brain does not distinguish sharply between what occurred and what is imagined. Dreams are vivid, they feel authentic. If a dream narrative is later recalled without awareness of its origin, it can merge seamlessly into waking memory. Imagine then communities under stress, sleeping lightly in shared spaces, their dreams carrying common anxieties, common images. The morning brings not only fatigue but also the blending of dream into recollection. Across dozens of people, the dream may spread by suggestion and conversation, gradually reassembled as an event that took place in waking life. To the brain, the line is porous. To society, confusion spreads. Another striking aspect arises from the brain's encoding of context. For every memory, there is not only the core detail but also the surrounding markers: place, emotion, language, environment. These contextual cues are fragile. Lose them, and the memory floats unmoored, hard to place, easy to discard. In disasters, context collapses. Landmarks are destroyed. Familiar sounds are replaced by shock. Communities find themselves later recalling fragments without anchor, unable to locate when or how something occurred. Without shared context, memory fails in chorus, entire neighborhoods holding fragments that never bind into coherent story. It is this collapse that produces the eerie silence of mass forgetting. Some researchers propose that the brain's collective vulnerabilities evolved not merely as accidents but as features. Forgetting serves a function. To bury unbearable pain preserves survival. To misremember in the service of group harmony preserves social bonds. Even to forget together can synchronize communities, smoothing over differences, reducing conflict. From this view, the neurological fragility underpinning mass glitches is not malfunction but adaptation. The price of cohesion is truth-s distortion, but the reward is unity. And so the brain, at both personal and collective level, selects survival over accuracy. Entire groups drift into the same silence because silence keeps them whole. Case studies highlight these mechanisms. Following natural disasters, survivors frequently recall the same errors in sequence, misplacing days or forgetting hours with eerie similarity. Neurobiologists examining cortisol levels note spikes at the times when memory encoding should have occurred. Later, those missing blocks resurface not with factual recall but with imagined filling shared across the group. Similarly, in cases of school incidents where dozens of students report memory gaps, neurologists identify synchrony in stress responses and suggestion exchange, supporting the idea that the brain's defensive systems can operate in chorus, stripping memory with a unity that appears externally as mass amnesia. The interplay between emotion and neural circuitry also explains why some false memories grip with such conviction. The amygdala tags experiences with emotional salience. Once tagged, impressions are prioritized in storage, whether authentic or not. A rumor told with drama, a misremembered tragedy spoken with tears, floods the neural pathways with emotional weight, ensuring consolidation even if the core fact is false. Entire groups, sharing the same emotional environment, lock false details into memory with astounding durability. Decades later, people can recount them with the same certainty as genuine events. The brain rewarded the memory not for truth but for intensity of feeling. What makes collective lapses so haunting is precisely this intersection of biology and society. The human brain is wired to be vulnerable and malleable, and society amplifies these vulnerabilities through contagion, suggestion, and repetition. When communities misremember together, the explanation is not mystical, yet the mystery remains powerful. It is the ordinary brain, multiplied 1,000-fold, producing extraordinary patterns. To dwell upon this realization is to feel at once fragile and profoundly connected, to know that one's memories are not fully one's own but part of an invisible architecture shared across neighbors, families, entire cultures. In this light, reality itself feels soft. We trust our memories, yet they are reconstructions. We trust our societies, yet they are built upon shared reconstructions, vulnerable to distortion, silence, and invention. Neuroscience tells us precisely how these errors can unfold, yet knowing the mechanics does not lessen the wonder. For if memory is fragile clay shaped anew at every touch, then so too is our world a sculpture constantly reformed. The mystery of collective forgetting becomes not an aberration, but a glimpse into the essence of human cognition. We are not cameras. We are painters painting together on the same canvas, layering colors, erasing, reshaping. And sometimes, mysteriously, we paint in silence, leaving portions blank where yesterday should be, erasing whole patches in unison. To reflect on this while drifting into rest is to find peace in fragility. We cannot hold every detail. We cannot preserve every truth. But in the softness of memory lies beauty, the capacity to adapt, to bind, to rebuild. Though communities may forget together, they can also rebuild together, and though details fade, the essence of connection endures. The human brain, fickle and fluid, prone to glitches and alignment, offers not certainty but communion. And perhaps it is that communion which matters more than accuracy itself. For accuracy, however solid, is solitary, but communion, though fragile, is shared. And so we leave this reflection not with fear but with gentle awe. In the circuitry of the brain, in the flood of chemicals, in the fragile patterns of neurons lies the explanation for both the glory of memory and the strangeness of its failures. What appears extraordinary is the natural consequence of ordinary fragility multiplied across many lives. If towns can forget, if nations can misremember, it is because the organ of remembrance is not a vault but a field of shifting grass, shaped by wind, shaped by company, shaped by need. To embrace this vision is to see human life as what it truly is, a shared dream, shimmering, delicate, prone to fading, yet endlessly renewed in every act of remembering together. When science has offered its explanations, when neurology has spoken of hippocampus and amygdala, of hormones and neural pathways, there still remains something unaddressed, the human urge to interpret forgetting not merely as accident of biology, but as symbol, as omen, as touch of the divine upon the fragile landscape of the mind. For the mystery of collective memory glitches has never been held by science alone. It has for centuries been the realm of myth, of sacred story, and of cultural imagination. Wherever silence spread across communities, people sought reasons larger than their own frailty. And into that silence they poured the language of spirits, gods, and ancient forces, for in the absence of remembrance, imagination rushes forward to fill the void. The ancients did not shrug at mass forgetting. They gave it shape. They gave it names. Across civilizations, the phenomenon of sudden forgetfulness was described in terms of rivers, veils, curses, and blessings. To forget was not only an error but a passage, not only weakness but transformation. In Greek tradition, memory was personified in the goddess Mnemosyne, mother of the Muses. To honor her was to preserve art, history, and language. But counterbalancing her presence was Lethe, the river of forgetfulness in the underworld, whose waters stripped souls of their earthly past before reincarnation. For entire communities to forget together was thus seen as if Lethe's stream had passed invisibly through their waking streets, washing memory away. It was not mere lapse but contact with something sacred, a cleansing both feared and revered. Such motifs appear again in many mythologies. In Hindu and Buddhist thought, memory and forgetting are cycles of karma and rebirth, instruments by which souls return anew unburdened by lives already lived. Forgetting is not failure but necessity, a gift ensuring the continuity of existence without unbearable weight. One finds echoes of this principle in stories of whole villages said to have woken newborn after festivals, not recalling the prior season, as though the gods had pressed the reset button upon their minds. These cultural explanations reveal a pattern. When people cannot explain forgetting materially, they cast it as sacred renewal or divine correction. In Norse sagas we hear of Mimir's well, from which Odin sought wisdom at terrible cost. Yet lurking alongside the pursuit of knowledge is the hint of forgetting as balance. To drink deeply from one spring is to risk losing from another. Collectively, this idea is reflected in tales where tribes wake as if covered by fog sent from gods, forgetful so that they must seek wisdom anew. In these tales forgetting is a teacher, a spur toward humility. In the sagas, mass lapses are signs of transition, preludes to great change. Communities who forget as one are communities marked by the divine for transformation. African traditions likewise preserve stories of forgetfulness on grand scale. In West African cosmology, memory is bound to ancestors, who act as keepers of history and identity. Yet stories also speak of the night of forgetting, when ancestors allowed descendants to be covered in a blanket of amnesia, protecting them from knowledge too dangerous to carry. In this cultural lens, forgetting is protective, not destructive. Communities awaken confused, but this very confusion acts as shield. It spares them the burden of truths that might fracture them. Here, collective amnesia is divine mercy. It arrives not with violence but with gentleness, erasing pain before it can wound. Among indigenous peoples of the Americas, stories tell of villages swallowed by mists that steal memory away. Elders describe generations who awoke unable to recall the names of spirits or the sequences of festivals. While from one perspective this looks like mere error, within their cosmology it was interpreted as the movement of spirits among them, choosing to reclaim memory for purposes beyond human grasp. To forget, collectively, was to have been visited. The people, rather than despairing wholly, often responded by reenacting rituals anew, creating a fresh narrative in place of what was lost. Forgetting was not only theft but an offering, a demand that culture be renewed through new performance. In medieval Europe, this attitude persisted in Christian interpretations. Sudden lapses of memory were described as God's punishment for sin or as the devil's deceit. Monks wrote of villages who turned their faces from God and as consequence awoke unable to recall their prayers. At other times forgetting was framed as grace, God lifting the burden of sorrow from a suffering people by stripping memory of violence endured. Whether depicted as punishment or mercy, collective amnesia carried religious coloring, a sign that heaven or hell had laid hand upon the temporal world. The silence of memory was never neutral, it was message. Such interpretations reveal less about objective cause and more about human need. To endure forgetting requires framing. If people were to believe they simply failed biologically, despair might overwhelm them. To believe they were touched by gods or spirits gave them narrative, purpose, even dignity. The blank spaces in their history became sacred spaces, not merely void but chapters written by invisible authors. Through religion and myth, the inexplicable was woven into the continuity of life, and forgetting itself became story. The motif of curses often appears. Communities believed that when they broke taboos or offended supernatural beings, their collective punishment came not always as flood or famine but as stolen memory. To have the past stripped away was the ultimate humiliation, for culture itself depends upon recall. A town that forgets its festivals, names, and lineages stands naked before its gods, humbled, reminded of its dependence on higher power. When memory returned, haltingly in fragments, it was interpreted as forgiveness, as covenant restored. The memory wasn't merely neurons firing again, it was grace bestowed. The symbolic use of forgetting reaches deeply into myth because of its intimate tie to identity. To forget is to lose self, to forget together is to lose society. Thus, when entire communities experienced lapses, cultures spun myths that fit the deepest anxieties, the dread of losing who we are, the terror of becoming blank. Into that dread stories poured themes of punishment, mercy, rebirth, divine visitation, or the crossing of boundaries between worlds. Forgetting became not mistake but passage, a threshold between identities, a shifting of worlds, a cleansing river run through the village in silence. It is striking how often forgetting is linked to water, mist, or veils. These symbolic forms echo the lived subjective experience of amnesia, the fog, the blankness, the sensation of drifting. Rivers of oblivion in Greece, mists of forgetting in America, veils of confusion in Africa, they all mirror the internal feeling people describe when memory fails. Myth took subjective sensation and gave it external form so entire societies could recognize and narrate it. Language clothed the nakedness of the void. Beyond symbolic representation, these mythologies often shaped practical response. Communities who interpreted lapses as divine punishment might enact rituals of purification, fasting, or prayer. Those who viewed it as mercy might commemorate the forgetting itself, creating festivals to honor amnesia as sacred event. In this sense, collective lapses did more than unsettle, they generated culture. They became moments around which identity could regather itself, not despite the forgetting but because of it. The void became foundation for new structure. This reveals something profound about the human condition. Even in absence, even in blankness, we find meaning. We do not let silence remain empty, we weave interpretation through it until it becomes bearable, even sacred. Collective forgetting thus becomes less an aberration and more part of the eternal dance between remembering and myth-making. The gods of memory and forgetfulness walk hand in hand, and communities caught by their influence dance the same rhythm, sometimes losing, sometimes regaining, but always narrating. The myth of amnesia also carried cautionary tones. Storytellers warned that pride invites forgetting, that communities who grow arrogant may wake without memory as lesson. In this warning lies truth, for societies that neglect careful record or ritual can find themselves genuinely forgetting. The myth, in this sense, both reflects and enforces cultural vigilance. Forgetting together became narrative device to promote humility, to remind people not to take continuity for granted. Like all myths, it both interpreted and instructed. When modern people look back on these interpretations, they may be tempted to dismiss them as primitive explanations. Yet if we listen carefully, we hear an echo of something enduring. For though today we explain forgetting with science, we still cloak its meaning in symbols. We speak of memory fading into mist, of griefs washed away, of secrets buried. We too use rivers and veils, gods and metaphors, because something in forgetting lends itself to poetry more than analysis. Our own fascination with collective lapses rises in part from this inherited mythic lens. When towns forget, we still feel as though they touched something larger than themselves, even if we no longer name it divine. To drift with these stories through the quiet night is to recognize how deeply forgetting is enmeshed in human imagination. It is both feared and treasured, both curse and gift. The myths tell us that communities who lose their pasts are never merely broken, they are transformed, invited to rebuild, to create anew. And in this, perhaps, lies a quiet comfort as well. For if memory is fragile, if it may falter at any moment, then so too is there always possibility of renewal. We are never only at the mercy of loss, we are also beneficiaries of the creative space it leaves behind. Listening to these myths in the stillness brings with it a sense of calm acceptance. For in them we find that forgetting, even en masse, is not final. It is a river carrying us forward, a mist we pass through, a veil lifted in time. The ancients remind us that memory is not merely archive but journey, and forgetting is not merely error but part of the path. To close one's eyes with these stories in mind is to rest gently in the knowledge that even when entire towns forget, even when whole communities lapse together into silence, the forgetting itself becomes story, and in that story lies continuity of another kind. What is erased in one layer is inscribed in another, and life, dreamlike, flows onward. When myth has spoken in the language of rivers and gods, when science has spoken in the language of neurons and chemicals, there yet remains another current that flows between them, whispering in the twilight where imagination and anomaly meet. This is the realm not of established knowledge but of speculation, where human beings explain their encounters with mass forgetting by reaching beyond the boundaries of the known. Here we find stories not only of biology or divinity, but of time itself bending, of dimensions overlapping, of reality stuttering like an old film reel. It is in this liminal territory that the phenomenon of collective amnesia takes on its most uncanny interpretations that may never satisfy the rational mind, yet which resonate deeply with the experimental strangeness of those who have lived through them. Communities who awaken together in silence often describe not only forgetting but a sensation of dislocation. It is not merely that details slip away, it is that the fabric of days feels unstitched. People speak of time moving differently, of the world becoming dreamlike, of waking into mornings that feel subtly askew. To explain such sensations, some envision distortions of time itself a fold in the continuum, a moment where the ordinary flow of past into present falters and rearranges itself. If time stutters, memory would falter accordingly, erasing segments, blending sequences, sowing confusion across entire populations. In this speculative view, mass amnesia is less psychological illness than glimpse into cracks along time's surface. Accounts of so-called time slips appear throughout the world. Travelers in cities claim to step suddenly into streets where clothing, architecture, and customs reflect another era, only to return moments later to their own century. Communities report that hours or even days vanish altogether, as though cut from the reel of history. If individuals encounter such disturbances, could entire towns experience them, not as singular visions but as shared alteration of chronology? Mass forgetting could then be explained not merely as mental collapse but as consequence of whole groups crossing briefly into altered temporal streams, returning with minds intact but records erased by the shift. Though mainstream science offers no mechanism, the stories endure, filling the imaginations of those searching for simple explanations to difficult experiences. In the law of dimensional theory, the universe is sometimes imagined not as singular but as led a multiverse of parallel realities flowing side by side. If so, then moments of overlap might occur, subtle crossings where one version of a community slides briefly into another. The change could be gentle, nearly invisible, save for the eerie disorientation of memory. Those who recall events from one version might find themselves surrounded by neighbors aligned to another, unable to voice their certainty without appearing mistaken. On rare occasions, perhaps, the entire group makes the shift together, awakening in consensus but inexplicably shorn of what once occurred. To those within, the experience is baffling detachment, memory lost without trauma. To those outside, it appears ghostly, as if an entire town walked briefly into a parallel corridor and emerged altered. This interpretive lens feeds into the fascination of the so-called Mandela effect, where large populations swear to alternate histories. Believers in dimensional anomalies propose that such effects represent bleed-throughs between worlds, collective evidence of transitions unnoticed at the time. Entire swathes of memory diverge because reality itself shifted beneath the feet of millions, leaving subconscious recollection of one past inside the bodies of those who lived it. Whether plausible or not, such explanations captivate because they resonate with felt conviction. To stand among thousands who insist on remembering the same false past is to feel reality itself unsettled, as if the world's foundation has momentarily buckled. Another framework comes from the vocabulary of energy. Some groups speak of memory as electromagnetic imprint, consciousness woven into fields beyond neural tissue? If so, localized disruptions of these fields might erase or distort memory across multiple individuals at once, particularly those inhabiting the same geographic location. Tales of towns experiencing strange lights in the sky, rooms filled with inexplicable humming, or visitors emerging into places where locals seem blank-eyed and disoriented, feed into these interpretations. From one angle, the narrative resembles folklore of fairy rings, of enchantments that steal time. From another, it resonates with electromagnetic disturbance or cosmic shift. The brain itself is electric. To imagine external currents sweeping away memory is not entirely alien, though science has not confirmed such events. Stranger still are stories linking mass forgetting to contact with forces beyond human comprehension. From UFO lore come claims of entire groups witnessing phenomena in skies, only for all but a few to forget the encounter shortly thereafter. Here the amnesia is interpreted as induced, a veil imposed to hide what should not be remembered. In abduction narratives, missing time is central, with individuals awakening hours later unable to explain the gap. Communities reporting shared lapses describe similar sensations: confusion, headaches, unease, then silence where memory should be. Believers argue that advanced technologies or beings could manipulate the fragile fabric of recollection, erasing cleanly not only individuals but neighborhoods, leaving traces only in fragments or in those strangely resistant. To skeptics, these claims read like science fiction, yet the persistence of testimonies assures their place in the constellation of interpretations. Haunting too are those cultural reports of curses, resurfacing in paranormal guise. In legends, sorcerers or shamans cast forgetting upon towns as act of power, removing whole sections of memory as punishment or control. Modern paranormal enthusiasts transform these into accounts of psychic warfare, suggesting that concentrated thought fields, or rituals performed with intensity, might alter the cognitive states of many. While experimental psychology finds little evidence for such mental waves, witnesses describe eerily similar patterns: dizziness spreading in groups, blankness overtaking crowds, memories evaporating in chorus. The modern framework may shift from magic to psi-energy, but the sensation remains: an external force has touched the fragile interior, leaving hundreds without past. Perhaps the most poetic frontier of speculation is the belief that forgetting at scale represents the thinning of reality itself. Communities clustered in certain landscapes, lonely valleys, isolated islands, sometimes report that time and memory drift strangely there. Traditions speak of thin places where the ordinary barrier between worlds wears weak, allowing spirits, gods, or energies to intrude. Forgetting is then a symptom of these thinnings, the mark of transitions between realms. In listening to such accounts, one hears echoes of both myth and modern anomaly. The mist rolls in, the villagers awaken disoriented, unable to agree on what day it is, what happened yesterday, what festival occurred. For the logical mind it is strange coincidence. For the poetic mind it is evidence of landscape itself folding them into dream. Even within contemporary paranormal discourse, time anomalies hold fascination. Whole aircraft or ships reported vanishing into clouds or zones for hours, returning with crew disoriented. Pilots speak of instrument malfunctions coupled with missing time. Extrapolate from individual accounts to communal experiences, and the possibility of towns slipping into similar pockets arises. If spatial or temporal anomalies exist, even fleeting memory disturbance may be their most consistent side effect, aligning dozens unconsciously in the experience of blankness. Such speculations may never reach laboratory proof, but they capture imaginations precisely because they offer narrative that feels commensurate with the grandeur of the mystery. One cannot underestimate the human need for wonder in shaping these interpretations. Science explains through mechanisms. Myth explains through gods. Paranormal speculation explains through the bending of reality. Each offers a mirror to the same phenomena, yet what compels most deeply is not which proves true but which resonates with the strangeness of forgetting en masse. For to awaken with neighbors in collective silence is to feel already outside the ordinary. Why not extend that sensation into explanations that match it, explanations of time divides, of parallel worlds, of energies beyond grasp? The metaphors align with the felt experience: fog, thinnings, veils, absences. Paranormal theories externalize those sensations, granting them cosmic architecture. And so the tapestry of interpretation grows ever richer. In the quiet of night one can imagine towns waking to discover days erased by time slip. One can imagine valleys visited by dimensions brushing close, turning routine into riddle. One can imagine the stars above shifting, alien hands guiding forgetfulness upon a populace unready for what they saw. Reality softens in these stories, but the listener finds calm in their rhythm, for they transform blankness into narrative, silence into meaning. Even if unprovable, they invite the imagination to move beyond the ordinary into dream. It may be that these stories are themselves a kind of collective dreaming, societies weaving coherence around absence, soothing their unease by casting mystery into mythic or cosmic shape. But in a sense, whether literal or symbolic, the effect is the same: towns forget together, and the forgetting feels less desolate when explained as contact with something larger. Science calls it weakness, psychology calls it cohesion, myth calls it divine will, and the paranormal calls it time slip or dimensional cross. Each voice, in its own tongue, says the same thing: memory is not fixed, reality is not absolute, and what we call the past is more delicate than we dare admit. To meditate on these possibilities is to drift into the liminal space oneself. One imagines a festival lit by lanterns, music echoing from drums, children dancing. Then dawn comes, and the people awaken blank, uncertain whether the festival took place. The streets are silent, scraps of paper decorations drift in breeze, but no one remembers hanging them. Was it blocked by trauma, stolen by stress hormones, erased by gods, or dissolved in a fold of time? Each explanation glimmers in the twilight, none wholly dismissible. The mystery remains, soft yet insistent. And the silence is real. It is in this silence that we finally rest. For whether explained by neuron or by river, by physics or by faith, the fact persists: communities sometimes lose memory together. The why may never be pinned down, perhaps because the human mind itself resists being captured in complete certainty. We live within stories, not charts, and when stories vanish, we must dream new ones into being. Thus forgetting, collective and strange, returns always to meaning-making, and meaning-making, whether scientific or supernatural, is the thread that binds us through forgetting into continuity again. And as the voice drifts lower into the rhythm of night, the listener, carried along by speculations of dimensions and time, of cosmic veils and fragile brains, begins to feel the subtle truth that reality is less a wall than a curtain, and memory less a fortress than a song. Both can fade, both can shift, both can carry us elsewhere. Entire towns may forget, entire nations may drift, but the forgetting itself becomes story, and story becomes memory anew. In the end, nothing is fully lost. It is only transformed, like dream into dawn, and dawn into dream again. When entire towns awaken into silence, when neighbors look to one another and find uncertainty mirrored back 100-fold, the mystery is not confined to the fragile workings of neurons or the speculative folds of time. It extends into the flesh of daily life, into the fabric of relationships, into the fragile contracts and bonds that make society possible. Memory is not only personal, not only mythic, it is the shared currency of trust. Without it, what is a town, a family, a law, a nation? In this sense, collective forgetting becomes more than anomaly, it becomes disruption of social order itself. And to trace those consequences is to see just how delicate the architecture of human life actually is. Consider first the realm of personal trust. Two people meet in the morning market. One insists that yesterday's South celebration filled the square, that the music played until dawn. The other frowns, unable to recall anything of the kind. Ordinarily, difference of recollection is minor, shrugged off with tolerance. But when the gap yawns wide, when whole families insist on experiences their neighbors disavow, the mutual foundation of reality begins to fracture. To live in community requires the confidence that others share the same past. Deprived of that confidence, suspicion grows like mold across walls. Who remembers truly? Who misleads? Is someone deliberately hiding truth? Out of the blankness, rumors bloom, carrying with them the seeds of paranoia. Families, too, tremble at the pressure of such lapses. The intimacy of kinship relies on shared experience, dinners eaten, holidays marked, arguments endured, reconciliations cherished. If collective amnesia spreads across a family table, with some recalling events others deny, the bond frays. Children look to parents, confused when stories contradict or dissolve. Parents feel the weight of responsibility yet cannot offer certainty. Whole generations risk misalignment, identity shifting like sand as memory fails to anchor. It is in such subtle yet profound ways that the forgetting of communities dissolves the invisible net of belonging, leaving individuals isolated even when surrounded by others. On the civic level, the implications deepen further. Law itself rests upon memory. Testimony, contracts, precedents, records all assume reliable recollection. If towns collectively forget crimes, disputes, or agreements, the machinery of justice crumbles. Imagine a courthouse where not one citizen recalls a theft that evidence plainly indicates occurred. Imagine a council where no member recalls laws passed the previous year. Disputes would stagnate, judgments become impossible, and the foundation of governance would rot. Without trust in collective memory, authority collapses into uncertainty. Leaders are suspected of deceit, neighbors suspected of conspiracy, and the very rules of society unravel. Collective amnesia, rare though it may be, acts as anti-gravity force against law, dissolving the weight that keeps communities grounded. History, too, undergoes fracture when remembered differently or not at all. For cultures, history is more than archive, it is identity. Nations define themselves by battles won, by revolutions endured, by sacrifices remembered. If those markers vanish or distort, national identity loses coherence. Scholars debate with increasing alarm how much of history is misremembered already, how much shaped by collective distortion. To contemplate entire towns forgetting grand events is to peer into the abyss of cultural erasure. It is not only individuals who disappear into silence but monuments, traditions, the sense of who a people are. If whole societies lose their past, continuity is severed, they awaken strangers to themselves. One must consider, too, the economic consequences of lapses en masse. Markets depend on trust, on memory of debt, on recognition of agreements. A community that forgets who owes what, or that goods were delivered, risks collapse of trade. Farmers forget which fields were tended, merchants forget which shelves restocked, buyers forget what price was paid. While such lapses may last only a day or two, the shock is enough to paralyze economies. What good is wealth if neighbors cannot recall its flow? Collective forgetting disrupts not just personal recall but the flow of value itself. Social research hints at still more subtle consequences, the erosion of collective narrative coherence. Communities thrive on stories. Songs, festivals, rituals all are ongoing narrations of who the people are. Mass forgetting acts like an earthquake across this narrative landscape, shaking foundations until cracks spread into every corner of tradition. Generations inherit gaps they cannot fill. Oral histories break. The we dissolves into fragments. Leaders, seeking to patch the rupture, may impose artificial stories, rewriting, smoothing over the gaps. In doing so they transform forgetting into opportunity for manipulation. Authoritarian systems perhaps thrive under such conditions, offering firm myths where true recollection collapsed. Thus mass forgetting can become seedbed not only for confusion but for control. From the individual's perspective, the psychological distress cannot be underestimated. To awaken with no memory of what others insist occurred is alienating enough. To awaken and find that none remember, that the community as one has blank minds, produces a vertigo like no other. Survivors describe it as losing gravity, as if floating unmoored from time. Anxiety, paranoia, and depression follow. Questions hammer without answer. If yesterday can vanish, why trust today? If festivals can evaporate, why believe in tomorrow's plans? The existential unease corrodes motivation, leaving people sluggish, suspicious, resigned. A community heavy with this malaise may enter cultural stagnation, unable to drive forward without confidence in its own thread of life. Interestingly, not all consequences are destructive. In some accounts, communities emerge from forgetting bonded in unusual solidarity. The blankness itself becomes shared experience. People look at one another, see mirrored confusion, and discover kinship in the void. They begin anew, building fresh rituals, recalling together what little survives, inventing rest. In this way the absence paradoxically strengthens cohesion. Forgetting wipes away divisions, placing all on equal footing of silence. Narratives rebuilt in the aftermath may be more unified than those fractured among competing versions. Thus, collective amnesia, while destabilizing, also carries strange potential for renewal, a chance to rewrite identity from clean slate. Still, the darker possibility continues to press at us, that collective forgetting undermines truth itself. Our age already groans beneath misinformation and conflicting narratives. If entire communities can sincerely lose recollection, even in fragments, then the idea of truth anchored in consensus weakens further. Skepticism spreads. People trust nothing, believe no voice, suspect every memory. Shared reality turns fluid. In such conditions, conflict sharpens. Political systems grope for stability, sometimes seizing with rigidity to counter the softness of memory. The memory glitch of a town thus amplifies into ideological struggle, shaping the direction of whole nations. Societies respond with rituals to counteract such fragility. Written records, memorials, monuments, and repeated ceremonies all serve as anchors, designed precisely to guard against forgetting. When collective amnesia occurs, communities often double their reliance on these anchors afterward, building new monuments, insisting upon repetition. The very act of commemorating becomes desperate bulwark against future lapses. Libraries expand, holidays multiply, archives grow heavier, all because memory itself cannot be trusted. The paradox emerges: the more communities fear forgetting, the more symbols they build, and the more brittle their culture becomes when lapses nevertheless unfold. One sees this reflected in stories of towns that forgot celebrations, only to rebuild them with even greater vigor after. Festivals become sacred precisely because they were once lost. Communities who forgot tragedy build monuments higher, as if height could guard against lapses. The psychology is clear: memory must be externalized when internal reliability falters. Collective forgetting thus leaves visible scars in architecture, ritual, and art. Towns that erase their past often overcompensate, their landscapes dotted with stone reminders. The haunting question remains whether such forgetting is isolated or whether, unnoticed, societies across history have experienced it again and again. Perhaps many of our blank spaces in record, many of our inexplicable gaps in tradition, derive not from lack of documentation but from moments when entire populations fell into silence. If that is true, then the consequences of forgetting are not exceptional but always woven into our fabric. Our histories are already shaped by unseen voids. Our identities rest not only on what was remembered but on what was erased. For the listener drifting in the late hours, this recognition invites a gentler perspective. The consequences of mass forgetting are indeed profound fractures of trust, of law, of economy, of identity. And yet, seen from another angle, they remind us of the humility with which we must hold reality. We rely upon each other to remember. We lean upon fragile beings for continuity. And when that continuity breaks, when neighbors look to one another with vacant eyes, we learn in silence how tenuous our world truly is. The lesson of these consequences is not despair but awareness, that beneath our calendars and archives lies a more fundamental truth: that reality itself is a shared story, delicate, revisable, fragile. To forget together is to stand at the edge of that truth. It is to feel the air grow still, to feel trust tremble, to feel identity sway. It is disorienting, sometimes calamitous, sometimes strangely unifying. Above all, it is human. For we are not machines holding records. We are societies of dreamers, rememberers, and forgetters. When our minds falter, so too our villages, towns, nations falter. And yet in faltering, we reveal the essence of who we are, creatures bound together not by certainty, but by the ongoing effort to reconstruct, to narrate anew, and to rebuild trust even after the silence of forgetting has washed through. And so we drift, reminded once more that in the social consequences of amnesia lies the deeper mystery, that our lives are fragile weavings, dependent upon memory not simply to record but to bind. When the weaving tears, fear rushes in. But so too does opportunity for new patterns. Whole towns may forget, history may fracture, trust may erode. Yet communities continue to rise, piecing together fragments, inventing new festivals, building new truth. The silence leaves its scars, yes. But it also leaves its gifts, the chance to begin again, the space to reimagine identity, the reminder that even when memory collapses, life itself goes on. To follow this long and winding thread of collective memory through history, science, myth, and mystery is to arrive finally at a place of quiet contemplation, where explanation gives way to acceptance. We have wandered through villages where festivals evaporated overnight, through communities that denied their own photographs, through war zones where days dissolved without witness. We have listened to the voices of science, tracing memory to fragile machinery of neurons and chemicals. We have heard the voices of myth, telling us of rivers, veils, mercies and punishments. We have listened to stories of time slipping, dimensions brushing past, energies bending the fragile circuits of the brain. And we have watched as communities, stripped of coherence, struggled to rebuild trust, law, and identity in the aftermath of shared silence. What remains now, in these final reflections, is not the urgency of solution, but the gentle calm of perspective. For what is memory, once all is said and done? It is the fragile mirror by which we recognize ourselves. It is the bridge stretched between past and present, trembling yet enduring. Without it we are shadows, with it we are stories. And while the glitches, the lapses, the absences terrify us in their destabilizing power, they also reveal the profound truth that memory was never meant to be perfect. Memory was meant to be human. It was meant to bend, to falter, to realign in the service of survival and community. In that bending we discover not only vulnerability but also resilience, for every time we forget we are given opportunity to rebuild, to tell, to create again. Think of it like walking along a shoreline at twilight. Each wave leaves a line in the sand, some deep, some faint. Soon another wave washes over, and the marks blur. The pattern of footprints fades, yet the shore is not empty. It holds memory of every step, woven into its texture. So too with human life. The waves of forgetting wipe the sharpness of detail, but the essence, the rhythm, the continuity persists in subtler form. And when communities forget together, it is as though a whole stretch of shore is smoothed, at once frightening to behold, yet inviting, offering a canvas upon which new stories may be drawn. This fragility does not rob life of meaning. On the contrary, it deepens meaning. Would we cherish celebrations so dearly if we knew they could never be lost? Would we build monuments if not afraid of memory slipping away? Would we gather in ritual, year after year, to retell stories of ancestors, if we trusted them to remain sharp forever? The very impermanence of memory fuels the richness of culture. It is forgetting that drives us to write, to carve, to sing, to build, that pushes us to remind one another across generations what is worth holding. Our arts, our myths, our sciences all rise as answers to the certainty that minds alone cannot endure the passage of time. And when forgetting strikes on scale, when entire towns lose their thread at once, it may feel like catastrophe, but it also becomes reminder of just how dependent we are upon one another. My memory is not only mine. It lives in you, in us, in stories exchanged, in rituals repeated. When one person forgets, another remembers. When many forget, those who remain recreate. The chain bends, yet continues. If sometimes it seems to snap, new links are forged. Humanity's story is not single thread but braided rope. Lapses in one strand are covered by the persistence of others. Seen from this larger perspective, even mass glitches become part of the natural texture of life. They teach us humility, reminding us that truth is not always at our command. They teach us solidarity, reminding us that our realities are built together, not carried alone. And they teach us calm acceptance, reminding us that much of what we cling to will slip from mind, yet in its slipping life remains, and beauty remains. Perhaps this is why the subject itself, disturbing in daylight, becomes so strangely soothing when told at night. As one listens to stories of silenced towns, fragmented wars, and speculative dimensions, fear gives way to drowsy wonder. The rhythm of uncertainty lulls the mind. The realization that nothing, neither memory nor certainty, was ever absolute invites rest. To let go of needing absolute truth, to accept the shifting nature of recollection, is itself a kind of dreaming. And so the phenomenon that unsettles by day comforts by night, allowing us to drift gently into our own quiet forgetting called sleep. As hours unfold into stillness, imagine gently the image of a town waking together in fog. Neighbors step into their doorways. They look at one another with puzzled eyes. They cannot recall the songs of yesterday, nor the prayers, nor the meals shared. And yet, though memory has dissolved, though silence hovers heavy, they are still together. They speak, they laugh nervously, they comfort, they build new stories where old ones vanished. The forgetting, though strange, does not destroy them. It only changes the canvas. They continue forward. And in that forward motion lives the quiet lesson that forgetting is never the end. It is only one of the waves shaping the shoreline of our lives. So take from these tales not only wonder at the mystery but peace at its meaning. Memory will falter, it always has. Sometimes alone, sometimes en masse. And yet humanity continues, building, singing, dreaming, resting. Memory may shape us, but forgetting, too, belongs to the pattern. Both are part of the weave, both necessary to the song. As this long journey of reflection closes, may the listener let the voice guide them not into anxiety, but into acceptance. For unanswered questions need not disturb, they can calm. Shadows need not terrify, they can soothe. The unknown need not punish, it can invite rest. Let the strangeness of forgetting whole towns, of memory dissolving in chorus, settle not as dread but as lullaby, a gentle rhythm reminding us that reality is delicate, and that delicacy is beautiful. Close your eyes, drift with the images, feel the quiet of collective silence seeping softly into your own rest, and surrender for a while to forgetting called sleep, from which tomorrow's memory will be freshly drawn. And to you, my dear viewers and listeners, who have followed this documentary through all its paths, thank you. May these words have offered you not only fascination but also calm, not only wonder but also tranquility. May you sleep gently, held by the mystery of memory, comforted by the acceptance of forgetting. Good night, and until we meet again, may your dreams be kind, and may your waking be bright.